The story you're about to hear is loosely based on true events. Daniel was a 16-year-old high school sophomore. He and his friends would walk to school. His friends lived a couple streets over, so they had more of an advantage than him, and he always wanted to catch up. Wanted to get to school early. So he would hop a short chain-link fence in the back of his yard. Belonged to a neighbor who was very friendly and didn't mind at all. But one day, the neighbor moved out and a new owner moved in, Mr. Smith and his wife Betty. Mr. Smith was an angry old man. He would yell and beat his wife. He hated children. Never had any with his wife. Thankfully for her, he noticed that Daniel would jump the short chain link fence. And he didn't want any of that. So one day, while Daniel was at school, Mr. Smith built a bigger, taller chain link fence covered in barbed wire at the top that Daniel couldn't possibly jump. Daniel started jumping the wooden fence, the picket fence, behind Mr. Smith's house, which also connected to Daniel's yard. He did this a couple times. Mr. Smith took notice. One day, Mr. Smith laid out a plank of wood covered in nails sticking out, each nail varying in size and shape and decrepitude. Large, rusty nails. He laid the block of wood down so Daniel, if he tried to jump the fence to go to school, he would land feet first onto these nails. Mr. Smith thought that would solve the problem. The next day, Daniel was on his way to school. He was ready to jump Mr. Smith's picket fence. He leaped over, but his foot got caught in one of the pickets, and he swung down. He swung his arms violently, trying to stop or cushion whatever blow he could, what he was about to face. His arm swung and knocked over the plank of wood, so it was up on its side against the fence. And then with all his body weight, Daniel landed face first onto all those rusty nails. They went through his eyes, through his nose, cracked his skull. Daniel could only moan in pain as he bled from each individual hole, pre-existing or newly formed in his head. Then all he heard was the fence creaking, the wood bending, as Daniel convulsed, as his brain hemorrhaged inside his broken skull. When the police asked Mr. Smith what happened, he said, "Well, the kid shouldn't have been jumping the fence." The policeman stared at Mr. Smith, silently objecting but silently accepting what he had just said. His wife sat behind him, tears in her eyes for what just happened to this poor young man. He was dead. Mr. Smith just scoffed and muttered to himself, "Goddamn kids. Goddamn kids. What a goddamn liability. The next night, Mr. Smith sat in his armchair in his living room, drifting off to sleep. His wife cowering in their bedroom, praying to God he would just fall asleep for the night on that chair. Mr. Smith's eyes popped open to hear a creaking sound. It sounded like a picket fence creaking, and metal hitting the floor drop by drop. He closed his eyes once again and tried to fall back to sleep, but it continued. And then he heard the slight moans of Daniel. How could that be? He wondered to himself. The kid was dead. Problem solved. No more. So he tried his best to fall back to sleep. Closed his eyes. And when he opened his eyes, he saw the screaming face of Daniel right in front of him. Empty, bloody sockets, staring into his soul. Translucent face, screaming. Mr. Smith jumped out of his chair. Holy shit. The fuck was that? He couldn't quite put his finger on what was going on to him. Just brushed it off as a dream. Went back to sleep. Same thing happened the following night. And the night after. So one night, he just sat up in his chair and said, "The fuck do you want, kid? Goddamn kid, you're not even alive anymore. What the hell are you doing in my house? Get out." He heard the sound of metal dropping on his ceramic floor of his kitchen. So he followed the sound. There was a line of nails leading outside. Opened his door and walked over to the fence. Every single nail holding his picket fence together was removed. Just a pile of wood in front of him. That was the fence in an open area. That's it. That's enough with that. I'm sick of these fucking kids, he said to himself. He got his hammer inside his tool shed, prepared to rebuild the fence in the middle of the night so that kids couldn't walk to school through his area. When he finally got done with it, he turned around and turned back. Every single newly placed nail holding his picket fence together was gone, and the wood was laying on top of each other again. Mr. Smith couldn't believe his eyes. Thought he was going crazy. He went back inside. The next morning, his wife awoke in bed. She noticed that Mr. Smith wasn't with her. So she went out into the living room to find her husband. He seemed to be peacefully sleeping in his armchair. She went over to wake him. She put her hand on his shoulder and walked forward. Every single nail that held their picket fence together was placed into the exact same order that it had on Daniel. Her husband mouthed agape, silent screams on his dead blue lips. All his wife could do was smile.